Well, at first, it certainly wasn't purposeful. Um, as I got into college and Skylar and I, really solidified, we really grew just an incredible network of relationships and friends. And
Mm-hmm.
my dad had this house in New Canaan still, and he was single, and the house was sort of offered up. And while I was a pretty serious student at Hotchkiss, I would not say that that was a um, characteristic of my Columbia experience. And I really lived for the weekends. And um, we would congregate these massive parties out in Connecticut. And it sounds sort of just flippant, but in retrospect, really what I was doing is like we were starting to build community. And it wasn't always just getting drunk, although certainly that was some of it. But it was a little more interesting. It was people would come out and read their poetry, and I was a musician and my friends were musicians, so we'd play music. And it had some real depth, some sharing, um, you know, qualities to it. And and it really kind of was a springboard into the rest of my life. And if I have to examine a thread that has
Mm-hmm.
pulled through the whole thing, it's really been around building community. And so much of
Mm-hmm.
that, to be honest, was a direct response to my inability to create connection early on in my life.
Mm-hmm.
And I sanctified that so much that it became the defining feature later in my life. And I think
Mm-hmm.
I obviously developed some skills around just general emotional intelligence
Mm.
and and more socio-emotional components of my life. But at first it was not particularly intentional. And then I founded a management company and a record label, but essentially what we really were doing was promoting events. We were signing
Mm.
bands, and we had some successes, and that was a lot of fun. But really, we were like putting on big shows every weekend in New York
Mhm.
City and pulling tons of bands on the bill, and bringing hundreds and sometimes thousands of people together um, to celebrate music and have a good
Mhm.
time.
Mhm.
I basically, as I grew my career within the music business, my contemporaries were starting festivals like Austin City Limits and Bonnaroo, and I had bands that were on all of these festivals, and I would go and I'd be sitting backstage, sort of grokking the social engineering that was happening at a lot of these big festivals, and just seeing the power of community um, to produce, in the case of music, a lot of joy, um, but also community is very protean. It can also um, really lead to a lot of healing and transformation.
Mhm.
And the biggest, most prominent example of that in my life um, was in 2001. So my office was in the little radius, right 2 blocks north of the World Trade Center, and September 11th happened, and in the collective grief, in the aftermath of 9/11, living in New York was a really interesting time. It was a time of tremendous unity and really beauty and grace in a lot of ways, where people found a lot of common humanity um, that seems quite absent now. But and also it inspired people to do somewhat crazy things that they might otherwise not do. And one of those people was my wife, and she built a yoga studio at Ground Zero, right in the aftermath of 2001 or 9/11,
Mhm.
in my building. And
Mm.
that opened, I think, in the early months of 2002. And and this was not like an Equinox or anything. This was the most
Mm.
rickety, humble little yoga studio you could possibly imagine. And it was, before there was a yoga studio on every block. Um, And a lot of people associate the financial district with business, but it's actually quite a residential neighborhood. And I basically just got a front row seat to witness the power of this little community center, which happened to do yoga, really change the arc of people's lives. I mean, they'd go up kind of these rickety lime green stairs, kind of past my office, and they'd, go into this tiny little one-room studio and sweat, and then come out into this tiny vestibule where they'd hung their jackets and shoes and sit on the floor. Or I think there's a little futon over there in the corner, and with their hearts open and sweaty and just have the most incredibly profound connections and really, rediscover their creative spark and really heal. And, that just completely changed the arc of both my professional and personal life. I was like, community, particularly in the context of healing modalities, is so powerful. And
I think you and I, really connect on this. This is, a big part of why I do this show and what we're doing with Gravity. And what I'm very intrigued with, this keeps coming up more and more so. I mean, even a whole bunch this week on various podcast episodes and kind of group conversation, thought leaders. There's a growing understanding, awareness of how kind of the people on the outside, can really make a difference in a pretty massive way that really ends up becoming the inside. Quote unquote. If you want to be that or not, it's like the fact that you were this outsider, the fact that you kind of got to understand what that was like, I think really ends up becoming this embodied experience. And depending on like how woo-woo you want to get with it, maybe it's a part of a divine architecture that's just such perfection, that we're not awake to for, most of our life.